Hello, 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 friends. Welcome to a new episode of Problematic FMC. Today, I'm going to dive into literary fiction. What does that even mean? Should you seek it out? Maybe you're already reading it and don't realize it. Or what are some books to get started with it? Let's dive into the show. To start off, I want to nail down a firm definition of literary. Unfortunately, this is not as easy as you might think. In mainstream circles, we describe books as literary when they fall outside of a formulaic genre, or when they contain flowery language, provide social commentary, or use metaphors or allegories. These are the titles that get shortlisted for the Booker. Some reviewers who prefer commercial fiction, another totally ambiguous term, although I do throw my own hat in with this lot most of the time, may use the term literary as a synonym for pretentious, or an author who takes themselves too seriously. Other reviewers who highly value the quality of writing may simply use the term literary to mean worthy of being read. But what is the publishing industry's definition of literary? NY Book Editors distinguishes literary fiction as anything that breaks the rules of genre fiction, including features of tropes, and letting the plot drive the narrative. The goal is not to entertain, they say, but instead to make the reader contemplate the human condition, and therefore the story, if there even is a story, is typically driven by the characters, whereas genre fiction is targeted at the masses, making the language and story more widely accessible. Literary fiction often uses vocabulary, styles, and writing devices that appeal more to critics than an everyday reader. Michael Woodson with Writer's Digest agrees that literary fiction prioritizes characters and themes over plot, emphasizing that literary fiction is less of a genre and more of a writing style. Endings of literary novels, Woodson warns, are more volatile and sometimes ambiguous, meaning you cannot expect a happy ending or even a full resolution. Book Riot unhelpfully points out that the purpose of a genre is to help readers know what to expect and to help booksellers know where to shelve a book within their store. The term literary fiction, they say, does neither of those things. Taking all of these definitions together, the description of literary fiction I'm going to settle on is this. A work is literary when the goal of the writing is to make you think more than to entertain. That doesn't mean you will not enjoy the story, only that the story is not the primary focus. It is instead a vehicle for a larger point the author is trying to make. For example, Harper Lee largely based the plot of To Kill a Mockingbird on her own experiences growing up as the daughter of a lawyer in rural Alabama. However, it wasn't the trial drama or schoolyard antics that Lee intended to pass along. Instead, it was the lessons about injustice and prejudice that came out of her experiences. Many distinguish literary fiction as a character-driven story and say that contemporary fiction is a plot-driven story. I personally take a big issue with this. We describe a story as character-driven when the major events are propelled by the main character's thoughts and feelings. However, I would argue that this is not realistic. No person acts in a vacuum, and all of our thoughts and feelings happen as a reaction to our environments. Maybe it's for lack of an introduction, but I have never heard of a fiction book that is spine-to-spine internal monologue. There has to be some kind of trigger outside of the person that stirs up those contemplations. On the other end of the spectrum, we describe a story as plot-driven when the character's thoughts and feelings do not appear much on the page, and it's really just a description of events. To me, that's poor writing. If any of your characters could be swapped out with a different person with a polar opposite personality, and the event would still unfold the same way, then no reader is going to connect to your story. Furthermore, if a character has no agency at all, and the story is just kicking them from one misfortune to the next, without them ever taking steps to combat their bad luck, the reader will lose sympathy for them. Great books that feel relevant to our daily life, therefore, must provide a healthy mix of both external forces and characters' internal commentary that give us insight into why they react a certain way. Some readers will refuse to read certain types of books that they perceive to lean more literary or more contemporary. I think this is a mistake. People who prefer books they believe will be literary may only want to read something if it will grow their mind or challenge them in some way. Totally fair. But to this reader I say, have you asked yourself to what end? What is the goal you hope to achieve? Maybe you're following a reading list, or you're reading through the short list of nominees for a literary prize that you've grown to trust. Or you're working through a full backlog of an author you've decided is important enough to justify the time. Any of those things could make a really rewarding project. I myself am working through C.S. Lewis's canon for that reason. But also be careful that you're not doing it for no better reason than that's what I have to do to be a, quote, real reader, or that's what I have to do for this group of people to take me seriously. If you're an English professor, maybe that would be the case, but most people are not English professors. As I've said again and again throughout episodes, your reading life should serve you. If reading something purely for the joy of entertainment breaks your rules, it would not hurt to reconsider if your rules are contributing to or stifling your relationship with reading. After all, a writer can say a whole lot of nothing and sound really good while doing it. Just watch any political candidate's speech ever. The publishing industry may fast-track someone with a newly acquired Master of Fine Arts, and the writer is just a little too proud of that degree. In cases like these, readers fail to resonate with their 500 pages of pompous fluff, but by golly, it was literary. Meredith from the Currently Reading podcast once described Ottessa Moshfegh as a young author who writes like she expects an award for it, and although I'd never read her, I knew exactly what Meredith meant. If you love Moshfegh, good for you, that's just one reviewer's opinion, but with so many books in the world to consider, that comment from a recommender whose taste I have found myself consistently aligned with, combined with Moshfegh's barely 3.6 average rating on Goodreads, has made me think she's not an author for me. I would also argue that it takes a heck of a lot of skill for an author to write in a way that makes you want to keep reading a story, even if there is no greater theme being conveyed or advanced vocabulary used to do it. Thomas Merton, a poet and theological philosopher, once said, "Art enables us to find ourselves and lose ourselves at the same time." Regardless of their reputation among publishing critics, contemporary authors have written stories that are compulsively readable, enough for their books to become bestsellers. Take two of my favorite authors, Sarah J. Maas and Kristen Hanna, or even take an author who I've refused to read on principle. It's a long story that I'm not going to get in here, but Colleen Hoover. Even if they are not writing earth-shattering prose, who can truly call them weak writers when so many people seek out their work? On the other hand, people who avoid more literary books may do so out of fear of boredom. It's hard to escape into a story when the writing feels pretentious, or when there's not enough action on the page to keep you guessing what will happen next. That's all completely valid, and pinpointing specific turnoffs can give you valuable insights into your reading preferences. However, when we encounter a book ick, I think we should look at it not so much as a dislike of any broad description, especially literary fiction. Again, that is an extremely subjective term, and how you define it may be completely different than how marketers or the reviewers you are seeing define it. Instead, if you DNF a book, you would serve yourself well by drilling down into exactly why it didn't work for you. Did you just not vibe with that particular author? Or maybe a very specific element of the writing style diminished your reading experience. For example, maybe there was a detached third-person narrator. Maybe the world building was inaccessible. Or maybe the prose just said the word maybe too many times in a row. My main point is that you should never completely ixnay an entire category of literature, even if that style hasn't worked for you in the past. As we go through life, we notice that reading preferences evolve, and certain seasons reflect what your brain needs in that moment. If you're moving to a new city, themes of adventure that break patterns of predictability, like Neil Gaiman's Neverwhere, may appeal more to you. If you're about to get married, a character study of opposing perspectives in a marriage, such as Lauren Groff's Fates and Furies, may hit harder than it did when you were single. If life throws you into a period of grief or reconciling after trauma, you may suddenly be attracted to the uncertainty and introspection that literary fiction offers in a way that you never had been before. If you're human, there is a literary book out there somewhere that will portray your unique struggles and heartbreaks in a way that will resonate with you. I encourage anyone afraid of less blockbuster titles to experiment and search for those hidden gems. I also think it's important to consider the sources that are feeding our perceptions of whether a book falls into the literary or contemporary buckets. As I demonstrated with the many varied definitions earlier in the episode, things that may make one recommender classify a book as squarely literary may just be a classic mystery novel trope that reader had never encountered before. Two very well-read people may consume the exact same story, but it resonates with one of them more deeply because they've experienced something similar, and to them, that book perfectly captures what it means to be human, while the other reader cannot relate. I think the only time it would be fair to close yourself off to a book because it's been described as literary would be if the person previously described a different book as literary that you didn't like. It really depends on the reviewer. Now that I've thoroughly cussed and discussed the term literary and made my case for why I believe any person may enjoy literary fiction, I will recommend some titles that may be described as literary. Again, my definition is that the goal of the writing is to make you think more than to entertain. First up, The Road by Cormac McCarthy. This and another one of his bestsellers, All the Pretty Horses, are two of my all-time favorites, but The Road seems to be his most popular title. A father and son walk through what is left of America after it burns. They head for the coast, and the dream that it may offer for safety, but food, water, and shelter are almost impossible to come by. They cannot trust any traveler besides each other. McCarthy is one of the most masterful crafters of dialogue I have ever read, and I still get chills remembering the vivid descriptions of the post-apocalyptic world he creates. This one does have a movie adaptation that's free to watch with an Amazon Prime subscription. Piranesi by Susanna Clarke holds a prime spot on my forever shelf. A man who goes by the name of Piranesi lives in an infinite house. This house has an ocean and birds and clouds and endless halls filled with statues. Piranesi spends his days exploring the house and charting its many rooms, reporting everything he finds to the other, the only other man he knows who visits him twice a week. Piranesi does not remember a time before this house and has no concept of the world beyond. It never occurs to him to wonder. I could reread this book 100 times and still find a new part of it to fall in love with. It's a story unlike anything I've ever read, and it immerses the reader in Piranesi's world, sorting through the puzzles right alongside him. It's almost not even a book, more like a escape room in the form of a book. It's beautiful and heartbreaking and at times disgusting and dark, but Piranesi has a beautiful mind, and it's a joy to spend time with him. Next, All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr. Part treasure hunt, part war tragedy, and part coming-of-age story, this book gives us a look into France during World War II, where a young blind girl befriends a German soldier over the radio waves. I read this one not long after reading Kristen Hanna's more contemporary title, The Nightingale, that also covers Paris during the war, and I highly recommend both. In Doerr's work, you'll find very accessible language, but a very dense story. I loved how he humanized a Nazi soldier in the character of Werner, while at the same time showing the terror of death, destruction, and thievery of Hitler's regime. This one has been adapted into a Netflix series with fantastic acting. The Measure by Nikki Erlich is one that I still think about over a year after reading. One day, for some reason that is never explained, every adult in the world receives a box with a string inside. Some people's strings are short, and those people die very soon after the boxes are delivered. Other people's strings are long, and they come to understand that the length of their string corresponds with their lifespan. What follows is civil unrest, distrust of short stringers, who the general public perceives as having nothing to lose, and a global conversation about mortality and equality. Ehrlich follows 8 characters through the chaos as they deal with the fallout on families, politics, the military, healthcare, and every component of society. This book, released in 2022, and comments indirectly on the public discourse surrounding the pandemic of 2020. Readers closer to the release date were intimately familiar with surviving an event that shook the world. However, the themes at its heart are timeless, including the threat of public hysteria, the role of activism, mankind's tendency to separate society based on immutable characteristics, and the most haunting question of all: would you open your box? Circe by Madeline Miller is one of many literary retellings of Greek myths. A daughter of the sun god Helios, Circe seems insignificant in the Titan court. When Circe teaches herself witchcraft, her power threatens Zeus enough for him to banish her to an island where she must survive many of the most grisly figures of mythology, and she fatefully meets and begins an illicit affair with Odysseus. For me, the first third of this book really felt slow, and I struggled to identify with Circe's character. However, when she gets onto the island, the story became unputdownable, and really cleverly weaves together this intimately human heroine with so much violence between these cosmic forces. So, that is 5 of my favorite books that fall on the more literary end of the spectrum, and I do believe they are all accessible enough to be enjoyed by many different types of readers. What do you think? Have literary books worked well for you in the past? What are some key things you look for when determining if a book is well written? Do you read more for the plot or more for the characters? Head on over to my Instagram page or blog and let me know. Until next time, keep flipping those pages. Bye!